The musician Boyd Rice has been a cult figure for decades, and for most of that time, he's been accused of having an involvement with neo-Nazism, if not being a neo-Nazi himself. The best-known evidence for this is a 1988 photo of him with Nazi skinhead leader Bob Heick, and more recently, a TV interview with white supremacist leader Tom Metzger has resurfaced and been circulated online. But Rice's involvement with these politics goes much deeper. In fact, he played a key role in the creation of the book Siege by neo-Nazi terrorist ideologue James Mason. Siege promotes guerrilla warfare and racist serial killers and proclaims Charles Manson as the new neo-Nazi guru. It's become the Bible of a new wave of aspiring neo-Nazi terrorists, the most infamous of which is the Atomwaffen division, who've been connected to a number of murders. And there are now a number of similar groups around the world and splinter groups as well in the United States. The following material I'm going to present is taken from the chapter on Boyd Rice in my book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege. You'll find a link for it below. The book explains in greater detail the role that Boyd Rice, Adam Parfrey, Michael Moynihan, Nicholas Schreck, and others played in discovering and promoting Mason, which culminated in the 1993 publication of Siege. Boyd Rice's career started in the late 1970s when he released an early industrial music album which attracted some attention. By the 1980s, he had developed an interest in Charles Manson and Adolf Hitler. This, however, took a dark turn when, at a gun show, Rice met a white supremacist named Victor Malik. Malik told him about James Mason, a neo-Nazi who was actually friends with Charles Manson and who published a newsletter called Siege, which praised Manson as his new leader. This quickly led to Rice's involvement with the neo-Nazi scene. His most intense period of this was between 1986 and 1989, although he kept in touch with his new friends that he had made for many years afterwards. During this time, Rice was a key player in the creation of Mason's Siege. He's the one who first found Mason, and then he introduced him to others, including the book's future editor and publisher, Michael Moynihan. In short, no Rice, no Siege. All of the letters that you'll see in this video were written by Boyd Rice and sent to James Mason, and they're held in the James Mason collection at the University of Kansas. In the very first letter from April 24th, 1986, Rice introduced himself to James Mason and asked for copies of the Siege newsletter. Rice wrote to him, quote, "I am completely of the Manson-Hitler thought and do whatever I can to further it." In his second letter to Mason, Rice included a collage which showed Charles Manson holding up a cross-like swastika. Rice added a note saying that, quote, "A friend in New York did this. I gave him your address, and if you haven't heard from him yet, I'm sure that you will." That friend in New York was Adam Parfrey, who would go on to fame as the founder and publisher of the underground press Feral House. In fact, the first book that Mason's work ever appeared in was Parfrey's infamous anthology, Apocalypse Culture. Rice also wrote to Mason and recommended that he, quote, "consolidate some of the issues dealing with key topics and key concepts into a best of Siege to at least take the seeds of that thought and situated it out amongst men, out in the world to take root, grow, and become something with a life of its own." But these letters were just the beginning of Rice's journey into the neo-Nazi movement. At the end of that same year, in December 1986, Rice appeared on the cable access show Race and Reason. It was hosted by notorious white supremacist leader Tom Metzger of WAR, the White Aryan Resistance. Co-host Tom Paget joined in for the interview.
What?
Which group?
Well, the last group above the...
Death in June? Oh, Above the Ruins.
Above the Ruins.
I haven't really heard Above the Ruins yet. I've just heard of them. But I know there's one guy from Death in June and one guy from Screwdriver, so I assume it's...
Well, I'd have to interject that electronic music is very white, just by its very nature. I think you see too many non-whites listening to that kind of stuff. It just seems intrinsically white to me.
Well, our producer here has been into electronic music for a long time, Dave Wiley, and I don't think it plays on the same wavelength as a lot of the minorities. That's my opinion, but I'm surely not an expert on this.
Yeah, that's what I feel too. In fact, people in the press, this music I do, the press dubbed it industrial music after this one band that called themselves, said what they were doing was industrial music. And it had been said that this was the first white music, to come out in hundreds and hundreds of years, because a lot of the popular music's been influenced, black influences.
Well, and this,
Little Richard and so on.
Exactly. Well, this
As modern music has been pretty much propaganda instrument of Jewish interests and black soul and so forth, you see emerging a new propaganda art form for white Aryans.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, do you feel that the music that we're talking about here is sort of the beginning of an orchestration of an Aryan underclass movement?
I think so. I think it's engendering a new will among people. That's what I'm interested in.
How do you feel then about racial separation and tribalism and as opposed to national borders and things along these lines?
Well, it seems like the only intelligent way to go. It seems like the way people would go if they weren't forced to go another way.
After the taping, Rice spent New Year's Eve with Metzger. He later wrote to Mason about his impression. "I liked him a hell of a lot. Liked his attitude and his outlook. He's really doing it." And the two stayed in touch for at least a decade afterward. Now, Rice's album, recorded under or released as Non, Blood and Flame, was released at about that exact time. And it was the first time that there were Nazi references in his released musical work. And this included on the sleeve itself a quote from anti-Semitic Nazi propagandist Alfred Rosenberg. Rice would continue to use Nazi references, albeit in different ways, for the rest of his career. But this was the starting point as he had first come into contact with the violent neo-Nazi milieu. In February 1987, Rice sent Mason a photocopy of a newspaper clipping about a black man who had raped a white woman and was arrested. Next to it, he wrote, "Happy Black History Month." The letter after that Rice wrote to Mason had a swastika on top of it. Rice said he'd just read the book White Power by American Nazi Party leader George Lincoln Rockwell and described it as, quote, awesome. He signed the letter off with 88, which stands for Heil Hitler, and Rice would sign several more letters to Mason that way. Right when he had contacted Mason, Rice was visiting Charles Manson in prison. Although often overlooked, Manson was himself a racist and an anti-Semite. Rice said, "Imagine having the chance to spend 4 or 5 hours with Hitler every week. Imagine how much you could learn. That's how it feels being with Charlie." In 1987, Rice started associating himself with the label fascist, although not Nazi. In 1988, he was hanging out with Bob Heick, the leader of the first national Nazi skinhead group, the American Front. One of their more audacious actions that year was to hold a white workers' march on May Day, the traditional socialist holiday. Afterward, Rice wrote Mason that, "We just staged a May Day march down Haight Street here in San Francisco, and the results were great. 65 skinheads with signs and banners, but it looked more like a few hundred." Now, Rice's use of the word "we" in the sentence should not be overlooked. Regarding the American Front leader, Rice later said that he was, quote, "good friends with that guy Bob Heick. I really liked him and I really liked all his friends." So it's very clear that in the late 80s, Rice did not shy away from publicly associating himself with neo-Nazis. He had also founded what he dubbed an occult fascist think tank, the Abraxas Foundation, and it included Adam Parfrey and then later Siege's editor Michael Moynihan. The American Front's paper, Aryan Warrior, ran what was essentially a press release for the Abraxas Foundation in one issue. Now, this was all happening at the time there was a rapid rise in murders which accompanied the emergence of the Nazi skinhead movement in the United States. The most famous of these was the killing of Mulugeta Sirah, who was an Ethiopian immigrant who died at the hands of a Nazi skinhead gang in Portland, Oregon. That gang was associated with Tom Metzger, who in turn by then had forged an alliance with the American Front. A mere 4 months after Sirah's death, Rice's infamous picture with Heick appeared in Sassy, which was a popular teenage magazine for girls. It showed the two of them in American front uniforms, and Rice was holding a knife. That photo would follow him around as undeniable evidence of his neo-Nazi ties. While over the years he would downplay it, at the time he hid nothing and even appeared in an American front uniform alongside Heick on a national TV show. As the skinhead leader was being interviewed, Rice stood behind him and drew a swastika on a store's gate.
His once dying white separatist movement.
In and amongst this entire street, in and amongst all this multiracial slime, it says, destroy racism. It's like, yeah, right. Goodbye, destroy racism.
Those disenfranchised kids are eager disciples for the simple black and white philosophy of white is right.
There's a...
That summer, Rice put on the 88 performance in San Francisco, where he was joined by Adam Parfrey, the Satanist Nicholas Schreck, and others. That event had both a Satanist and a Nazi theme. Again, 88 standing for Heil Hitler. And there was a group picture taken that night of the performers and their friends, and it shows them all sig heiling and includes both Rice and Heick. In public, Rice denied the performance had been any kind of serious political event. But privately, he wrote Mason that he would use, quote, whatever label is necessary to put out our thought. At the end of 1988, Rice introduced Michael Moynihan to James Mason. Moynihan quickly agreed to turn the Siege newsletters into an anthology and publish it. Moynihan joined Rice for a 1989 tour of Japan and then moved in as his roommate. They lived together practically through the end of 1992. Now, what this means is that almost all of the Siege anthology was put together while Moynihan was living with Rice. Again, during this period, Rice still had no compunction about appearing publicly with James Mason. In 1991, Mason joined him on Christian preacher Bob Larson's show Talk Back. Rice was in Larson's studio when Mason appeared on the show a second time. That April, that is less than 2 weeks after Mason received his copy of Siege, Rice was photographed at Mason's house. And again, the next year, they posed together for a picture while they were out for a night on the town. Even though Rice and Mason remained in contact through 2003, by the mid-1990s, Rice started to deny his level of contact with neo-Nazis. I personally saw him do this in 1996 after a show in Albuquerque when he was confronted about his politics by a rather large Latino man. He weaselly denied everything. As part of this downplaying, Rice had to address the Sassy photo. While in the late 90s, Rice was still willing to call Heick a good friend, by 2018, Rice said he had only known the Nazi skinhead leader for, quote, 15 minutes. As part of this evasive strategy, Rice liked to accuse others of what he himself was guilty of. So one of the more outrageous examples that we have good documentation of involved a 1987 benefit show he helped put on or tried to put on for Charles Manson. It was canceled in part because there were accusations of white supremacist involvement. In an interview done immediately after the cancellation, that was done with both himself and his collaborator Nicholas Schreck, Rice blamed the filmmakers themselves who are interviewing him for the rumor.
Well, where do you think the rumors of white supremacists behind, or whatever, behind this concert came from?
Because of a very shallow misinterpretation.
Where did that misinterpretation start?
I think it probably came from you, because you interviewed James Mason. And people knew Mason was connected with Manson, and they knew we were connected with Manson, and they knew that there was this whole network of people who were interested in Manson.
In fact, at that very moment, Rice was in close contact with Mason. After the canceled shows, Rice sent him a letter, again with a swastika on top, bragging about the bomb and death threats that had been made. Now, I'm going to try to summarize my thoughts here. Rice has been repeatedly accused of being a neo-Nazi himself. So if we mean by this a believer in National Socialist ideology, I don't think that this is the case, at least judging from his written and spoken statements. There is some direct evidence that suggests this. He wrote letters to Mason that had swastikas on top. They had 8/8s. A couple times he refers to like our project or whatever in the together. And he did, of course, appear in public at least on 2 occasions in an American front uniform. But in what I've seen, Rice never expressed certain key elements of the National Socialist doctrine. He did express casual racism and anti-Semitism, but he did not express Aryan supremacy or anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, he may have believed in some of these ideas privately or thought privately of himself as a National Socialist. But if he did that, he never said it, and he didn't even say it in his private letters to Mason. That is, copious evidence exists which shows, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Rice was indeed a neo-Nazi collaborator. He spent many years amongst the most violent elements of that scene, and he played a key role in the spread of neo-Nazi terrorist ideology. If you'd like to know more about how James Mason developed his terrorist brand of neo-Nazism, as well as the involvement of Boyd Rice, Adam Parfrey, Michael Moynihan, Nicholas Schreck, Thomas Thorne, and many others in the neo-Nazi scene, check out my book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege, which is now available on Routledge.